Carla, I really appreciate you coming into my office today to have this conversation about your teaching. I know this can be a somewhat difficult conversation to have because we're going to be talking about your value-added scores. As you know, you had a 1 last year, and how we give you and talk about some strategies for this year to have a different result with student achievement. I know you want that, I want that. This is why we're on a team together to really focus on how in your teaching to improve some of those strategies and not about you as a person. So I appreciate your willingness to talk because it's important. Also, as you know, with the state rule change that now I will be observing you more frequently this year in the name and in the spirit of giving more timely feedback as a way of helping. And I think that's important too. So again, I appreciate you coming in this morning to have this conversation.
Well, thank you for putting it that way. I've been really nervous all summer since I got my scores back, and I've been confused and wondering, oh my goodness, what's going to happen this year? Am I a bad teacher? On one hand, I had those observation scores that said I was on track and doing what I was supposed to be doing, and then the value-added scores came back that said, no, you're not effective. And that threw me for a loop because all this time I've been thinking that I was a good teacher.
Right, and as you noted correctly, you were receiving, for the most part, 3s on your observations last year, and then as you're saying, to get this disconnect with the 1 in value added. So that's what we're going to be talking about during the conference this morning.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about 3 things in this conference today. One is to look back, and I brought in the observations and for us to dialogue about if you see any patterns about, I noticed as we've been talking about with the importance of grouping and what that looks like. Second, to really look at what kinds of evidence were you looking at and this year can be thinking about of evidence of student learning. That might be different from what you were looking at last year, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, I want to talk about some strategies I'd like you to use in this first grading period, revolving around student evidence, student work, and we'll talk about that too. So let's just talk about, from last year. Let's reflect a little bit on what you thought, especially around grouping and that area about patterns you see connected now that the value-added scores have come out. So talk to me about that for a minute.
Okay, well, according to what I understand about the grouping piece in the rubric, I needed to demonstrate to you that I can put my students in different types of groups. And so for both of my observations last year, I had whole group instruction, and then I did some think, pair, share where my students were partnered up with another student. And then I even had small groups of 4 to 6 students in a group to demonstrate that I knew how to put students in groups.
And I thought that was really effective as the first part of this area, as you just said, the variety of grouping, how you were thinking about pairing versus small group versus whole class instruction. The key point now is, what evidence do you think you had of student learning when you ended that particular lesson? What kinds of student evidence, so that you knew where they were in their own mastery or non-mastery by the end of that period? And I think that's a key question I'd like to ask you to think about.
Well, as I think about that, the only real evidence I was looking for were, their correct answers on a worksheet. And I have to tell you, I did not give a different activity sheet or worksheet to every group of students. And I did attend a workshop this summer that talked a lot about giving assignments based on where students are in their learning. And that was something I thought I need to find out more about and learn how to do in my own classroom.
So that's interesting. If that new information you learned this summer, think just very briefly, what would be now a way to maybe to show differently and for you to know more about evidence of student work and student learning now that you've had time to reflect and also gone to that training? How would that look slightly or somewhat different this year, let's say in that first week of school when you do your first grouping activity?
Well, one thing I'm going to do differently this year that I didn't do last year is spend more time on the front end finding out exactly where my students are. What is their level of achievement, their level of understanding. So I'm going to do more formative assessment, trying to figure out where they are. And then when I form my groups, I'll be a lot more intentional about how I form those groups based on the different levels of understanding that my students are showing.
That's great. I think, we've both been in this business for a while and realized, 10 years ago, if we were just focusing on those summative scores and if students hit the bar or they didn't, it was still okay in terms of how we were being measured. And now with value added, as we know, it has shifted to think about, as you just said, how do we know where every student starts, where they progress or don't progress, and where they end up. And I think you're really doing some great thinking about that shift in thinking. Does that sound accurate?
It does sound accurate. I might need some help somewhere along the way, just in terms of making sure the assignments that I do give my students are targeting their
Right.
need.
Right.
Because I've just been giving whole group assignments
Right.
in the past.
And I think that's where the strategies will come in. And so these three that I want to talk to you about briefly, I think will be effective. And I'd like you to try these in this first grading period. And then when we come back to post-conferences, both formal and informal, we'll talk about the effectiveness of these strategies and how you've made some shifts in your thinking. So that first one is really important about, let's gather and have you gather in that first 4 weeks of school some evidence of student learning from some of your lower performing students, maybe your mid-range and some high performing. Bring that to our first post-conference on observation, first pre-conference, and we can talk about what patterns you see and how to design perhaps some interventions, especially for those lower performing students. Because it sounds like then you're going to have a really good handle and know where they are if we're doing that kind of strategy.
Absolutely.
How does that sound to you?
I can do that. I can just start dropping some evidence in
Right.
files and go ahead and group that myself, low, mid, high if I need to,
Right.
and
Exactly.
you can help me walk through it.
Okay, great. The other strategy I want you to do is to, you work pretty closely with Miss Smith down the hall, and she's had a lot of success in this particular area with differentiated instruction, multiple forms of grouping, and give you some release time for about a half day to go and do some careful observation and dialogue with her. Because I know you've done that before, I've done that, where that kind of peer dialogue really helps you and your understanding and sharing of ideas, and also for things that you can take back in new strategies. Because I know how hard it is sometimes to get outside of your classroom. So I want to build in about a half day where you can get release time and go do that and then come back, and we can again talk about that at our next conference.
Okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
I feel comfortable going to Miss Smith. Now, will you talk to her?
Yes, and I
okay.
will. And I also think, yes, she will know, and it'd be important that you're letting her know this is obviously not an observation. You're coming in to really have some peer dialogue about best practices.
Okay.
And you have some best practices, and eventually this might become reciprocal too. So I think that'd be great. Finally, we'd like to, on your grade level, we're just beginning that PLC model about differentiated instruction, and I think that's a great opportunity for some professional learning experiences that you can engage with, again, through peer dialogue with your colleagues, so that you can talk about what's working. How do you get more student evidence in a timely way to know where they are? Because that is one of the factors for value added, is knowing where all your students are. And so I think your grade level PLC is really promising and doing some good initial work, and I'd like to see you be a big part of that as well.
I will definitely put those dates on my calendar. I did not attend those PLC meetings
Yeah.
as often as I should have last
Right.
year, so I'll definitely make sure I'm there and participating.
The intent, as you know, and I think hopefully we'll experience, is not in a punitive way. This is about how do you get more feedback, both from me and then also through your PLC, not in an evaluative format, but how do you get more feedback to know what's working and what's not working? And since you did have the one last year, so students were not making a year's worth of growth, it's important to get more feedback this year in order to do that. And I think those three strategies will be really important. The peer dialogue with your peer, bringing in student evidence, and we'll have more structured time and more formal feedback. But again, not in a punitive way, but in a way to really try to put in some different strategies for you this year because I know you really want to help your students succeed. That's what I want. We're on the same team about this, and I think that'll be powerful.
I do. I love my kids, and I just want the best for them, and I'm sorry that I let them down last year.
Yeah, well, and I thought that's where I hope, these methods and I think this conversation, even though it can be uncomfortable and difficult, better to have this on the front end than to go forward not really knowing some specific things. So I appreciate your openness to look at these and do these in this first grading period, and we'll keep talking. So I appreciate you coming in today.
Well, I appreciate your support.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for viewing the Coaching Conversations video. As you know, the core of evaluation is helping all of our educators continuously improve their practice. An incredibly important part of helping educators improve their practice is engaging in regular, substantive coaching conversations based around student learning data and observation data. Having these conversations early in the school year is especially important with teachers who previously scored a 1 on their overall evaluation or on their individual growth score. Recently passed state board policy upgrades require observations for these teachers. Explaining the new policy to your teachers is a perfect opportunity to start the coaching conversations early. Most of you have experience having coaching conversations, but we wanted to share 3 thoughts we hope you find helpful. Use data to guide the conversation. Identify concrete strategies and actions your teachers can try in their classrooms. Focus on 1 or 2 areas of refinement at a time during a manageable time frame. We appreciate all the hard work you do every day. Thank you.